It's bad enough for young people to be aware of the terrible tragedy which is going on, which is a murderous crime. I mean, it really, really, really is. But on top of that, to get the impression that the people who are responsible for doing it, particularly my generation, just don't care about them and about what they're doing. So I would like to say, if this is happening to you, I mean, please go and see somebody about it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. And today we're going to discuss a very important topic, and that is echo grief. And echo grief is the feeling of deep sorrow that many of us experience when we learn about what's happening to our planet and the living beings who call this planet their home. And I want to open up with a poignant line from Chief Seattle before he signed over his lands, really under force. And it goes like this. If all the beasts were gone, men would die from a great loneliness of spirit. For whatever happens to the beasts also happens to the man. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and the daughters of the earth. And I really want to point out the wisdom of what he said, because it's the wisdom of the ages. It's what the Buddha said. All things are connected. I think Jesus said, do unto others as you would have done unto you. And we know that all things are connected. We have an elephant, and when an elephant eats, the elephant passes that food, and there's the dung beetle who rolls the droppings of the elephant, which helps with plants. Everything comes from everything. With nothing, there's nothing. And so we can't have this arrogant spirit that that we don't need insects, that we don't need the animals, and that we're going to be just fine. Because as Chief Seattle said, it brings a great loneliness of spirit. And I believe quite strongly that even though many of us live in cities, somewhat divorced from nature, that loneliness of spirit prevails. It prevails. And whether or not a person is a climate activist, climate poet, artist, a scientist within the climate realm, that feeling is there no matter what. And I think it's no mistake that there is this whole movement called forest bathing, where people take time to be in the woods and be in nature to feel better, because we need to be in nature. And we're very, very off kilter. And it is bringing about this type of emotional grief. It's even got a name. It's called solastalgia. And there are psychologists and psychiatrists and some of our great universities here in the United States who are studying solastalgia and the great harm that it caused to the human being. And I do want to bring up some things that cause me great grief in this climate conversation. And I really just can't stand the slaughter and the murder of our other living beings. And it's not a small number. Trophy hunting, it kills 200,000 living beings a year. I hate to call them animals because we're animals too. So call them animals if you will, but don't forget that we're part of that. Every 22 hours, a human kills a rhino. Why? Why do they have to do that? It doesn't make sense to me. We're living in the 6th great extinction. Again, whether people are aware of it or not, it causes great, great harm to our collective psyche. We're destroying our oceans and the living beings that call the oceans home. We have to do much to heal ourselves and recognize that grief that we turn a blind eye to, so that we can accept the harm that we've done and work assiduously to undo it as soon as possible and as much as possible. Homo sapiens, we do not need to be the murderers of our planet. I know we don't want this, and this is why humanity is suffering tremendous grief. And I want to turn it to Dr. Peter Carter, because I'm sure that he's aware of the grief of which I speak.
Yeah, none of us can be untouched emotionally by what's happening, what in actual fact we are doing to our planet, Mother Nature, Mother Earth. And it's very distressing. In addition to that, I recall, I think about 3 polls have been done, specifically on climate disruption, the climate emergency, and polls on young people, if they're affected at all. And each one has found out that a very large proportion of young people are deeply, deeply affected. Now, things are so terrible out there that it's really impossible now for any young person to not hear what's happening, despite all the advertising and the jargon and all this kind of stuff. It is unavoidable now. It's unavoidable because the impact on the planet now is just so severe. Like we've gone through, the summer with unprecedented heat waves, unprecedented droughts, unprecedented floods. It's impossible. It's got to such a terrible stage that it's impossible to avoid. And it's very, very, very real. I want to mention a person I know who I would regard as the best expert on this in many ways, and that's Margaret Klein Solomon. She was one of the big movers on the climate mobilization in the United States. She is a qualified PhD in clinical psychology. So recently she's gone back to her work on psychology. And this is what she does. This is absolutely what she does. So I would also like to give the message, of course, to any young people or anybody for that matter who's out there and is naturally sensitive enough, to feel the grief, to feel the pain that other creatures are going through. Life, unfortunately, as I keep on saying, because I say it to myself, life is collapsing all around us. And a large proportion of our society obviously is able to block that out. But the younger people are particularly vulnerable, of course, because they're getting the message, number one, that our society doesn't care about their future and that people don't care about them. Now, that would be the very, very worst aspect of this. It's bad enough for young people to be aware of the terrible tragedy which is going on, which is a murderous crime. I mean, it really, really, really is. But on top of that, to get the impression that the people who are responsible for doing it, particularly my generation, just don't care about them and about what they're doing. So I would like to say, if this is happening to you, I mean, please go and see somebody about it, right? Many of us, for probably a year or two, have spoken about the need for a support group for ourselves and other people. And our climate emergency forum team is one of my support groups. So I am very grateful for our wonderful few people here. So yeah, I would encourage you to not keep it in, to express it, and to talk with your family about it, to talk with your doctor about it, see a counselor if you can, maybe read Margaret's book or some other book. But we definitely care about you. And a lot of my friends and colleagues definitely care about you and are working hard so that your future may not be as dismal as otherwise it will be.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I really appreciate you addressing the youth. I can't imagine growing up in this. It's got to be tough. And I think it's so important that you shared that we do care, Peter. I mean, we do care. And as Peter says, those of you watching, especially the younger ones, we care. And we feel the grief too. And Greta felt the grief. I mean, when she understood the scale of everything, she stopped talking and went to bed and couldn't eat. But she pulled herself up and out. And that is what I hope for everyone, because that is what we need. Paul, I want to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yes, thank you, Regina and Peter. So we all probably know what it's like to feel homesick, and homesickness used to mean that you would move off somewhere and live in another city, another part of the world. And you'd have a sense of loss of place, is what geographers call it. And often people that move away from, they're very attached to where they grew up, where they're from, where their home is. And often people will move away, and you can ask them decades later where home is, and they'll refer to where they're from, not where they've been living for the last several decades. So there's definitely this connection to place. But now, with abrupt climate system change, you don't have to move to feel homesick, right? The actual place that you're living can change so drastically from climate change, extreme weather events, the consequences of, say, drought or torrential rains leading to floods. The place where you're living, your home, can be completely wiped out. So you don't have to move to feel homesick. This is a fairly new phenomena, and it's hitting large numbers of people. The other thing I want to talk about is that animals, including humans, have the innate urge or feeling to procreate, to keep, for a number of different reasons. One, to keep their bloodlines going. It's one way people deal with an uncertain future. It's a way to sustain the population of your species. But now that we know that the future we're heading to is business as usual, looks very bad. It looks terrible. People are having their rational thinking mind is at conflict with this innate or internal mechanism to procreate, because they think, what kind of future will I be bringing my kids up in? What will their future be like when they're adults? And many young women are making the choice that they don't want to have children. So they're definitely experiencing this eco grief, this loss of place. Now, because climate change is a long-term thing, it's happening over time, although it seems to be accelerating and getting much worse. It's very difficult to feel intense grief for long periods of time. When the mind is feeling intense grief, it typically, the feelings soften over time, and that's a human response to allow you as an individual to endure and survive and to move on with your life and to deal with things in the future. So that's just the way that our brain works. So with climate change, it tends to, I had all of these feelings of grief. I mean, there's the famous psychologist, the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, where you go through them. But for the most part, I think to deal with, what's happening, I tend to have to compartmentalize things. And there's a couple different aspects. I mean, what gets me more, it's not the rapid change in our climate system. It's not the environmental changes. What gets me more is the lack of human response, the lack of human understanding, and the actual, the fossil fuel money that is going into saying climate change wasn't a problem before, and now saying climate change, yeah, it may be a problem, but it seems like there's a flurry of fossil fuel investment as these people and corporations realize that their number is up soon, right? So they're trying to squeeze every last drop out causing the problem to be much worse, accelerating things where, and that's their way of dealing with it. Squeeze every last dollar out before the whole industry collapses. Like that's what I get the most angry at. And that's what causes me the most angst and grief. So I tend to stick to, trying to figure out how the climate is changing and what it's doing, like the science aspects of it, as opposed to the craziness of fossil fuel CEO companies, of large banks funding them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Paul. I can really, really understand the desire to go in that direction and focus on the science, because the other aspect is so depressing. And what you shared to me was so moving about how you can feel homesick in your own home because of the fact of change happening right where you are. And you can get to a point where you don't even recognize where you're from. And it gives us this sense of unmooring. And I think one of the other key things you said to me was this feeling that no one cares. I think it puts people in a sense of isolation, sort of what Peter was saying, and these youth feel misunderstood and not cared for. That makes it so much worse, don't y'all think?
Yeah, it's the inaction is as bad as the actual changes in the environment, I think, to many people. Well, as Spock would say, it's totally illogical.
It is totally illogical. I will say that I went through a period of rather extreme echo grief where I just thought, how can I go on? This is just so horribly painful. And the part that was most painful is all of this terrible stuff is happening. All of these magnificent living beings are dying. The trees and the plants and the insects, and no one gives a damn. And that was the worst part of it. That was the major compounding factor of the tremendous grief. And Peter, I love what you say, that this is your support group, because don't we all need a support group during this time?
One thing about depression and anxiety that I guess probably everybody knows is that it's better to express your anger in a constructive way rather than hold it in. And then you've just got grief every day, every day, every day. So it helps me to periodically get pretty angry at who specifically is doing this murderous day after day action on Mother Earth and all and nature, who, as you say, Regina, of course, I mean, it's insane because everybody loves nature. I mean, they really, really, really do. So it helps me to feel pretty angry at the fossil fuel corporation CEOs, and because there are real people behind this. There are real powerful people making sure that actually nothing is done, making sure that there's no improvement, that there remains no response. That's infuriating, absolutely infuriating. And there are, of course, some responsible, active environmentalist NGOs who are working on that aspect and bringing that to people's attention. It's not that we are doing this; it's that they doing it, right? The whole of humanity, our species is pretty good. I mean, I know I've been a doctor most of my life. They're really, really pretty good. But we are being driven basically by world powers, by corporation advertising industry. We're socially engineered, etc. So yeah, I like to cast some blame, let me say.
I like the idea of turning our pain and grief and anger outward in a constructive manner rather than turning it inward, because that leads nowhere good. I'm wondering, Paul, if you have any final words to wrap this up.
It was a very interesting incident that happened recently with tomato juice being thrown on a priceless work of art. I think it was Van Gogh's Sunflower. Now, there was no damage at all to the art. I mean, they're in a museum, there's a lot of security, they're behind glass, they're protected. So the tomato juice didn't cause any permanent damage, but it's interesting how people many people, including myself, were very infuriated with that happening. How can somebody do that to a priceless piece of art? But then when you think about it, does this mean that we value something that humans make, much more than we value our home, our planet? Right. So after thinking about it a lot more, I thought, well, it's not so, it wasn't such a bad incident. It didn't cause damage to the painting, but it really, and maybe got a lot of people thinking about the climate issue. But it's very controversial. So other people are more against climate protesters than they were before. People are getting desperate. There's lots of people around the planet that are getting desperate about the lack of action towards the climate issue.
Thank you for those final words, Paul. It's really true. I had the same reaction you did. I think there's lots to think about. There's definitely a lot to think about. I think a lot of people thought those stupid kids, they just got it wrong. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that they did the right thing. But again, it does make us question our values. And yet we allow the fossil fuel industry, as Dr. Carter so reminds us very often, to kill 8 to 10 million people a year. So it's really important that we question our values and think deeply about these issues. And I feel very moved about the discussion that we had tonight. I thought it was very important, and I appreciate that we had the privilege of having this discussion. And I hope that those of you who watched and those of you who stayed to the end got something out of this. And if so, please hit the like button, please share, and of course, subscribe. And also, I really would like to hear about your grief. And I shared my grief about the species lost, the other animals besides Homo sapiens. What is it that is your grief? What makes you sad, and how do you deal with it? Please share that in the comments. We'd really like to get a conversation going. Don't let it just end with us. And so we'll continue that discussion, and we'll see you next time at the Climate Emergency Forum.